Steve's on it.
There we go.
He's got the power.
I was simply saying you weren't on yet. Oh, well.
As one of my friends from Oklahoma used to say, he's pert near deity.
Pert near.
Pert near deity. You can go ahead anytime, Leon. Those ladies will just stop. Yes. Thyatira. That's usually how we typically pronounce it, but all right, thanks. So any particular questions from last week on the first 8 verses? Okay, so we could hypothetically get done with all of chapter 1 today. So it divides up to 3 sections, verses 9 through 11, 12 through 16, 17 through 20. Any particular questions you want addressed from verses 9 onward? Go ahead. Okay. All right. Okay. Oh, we'll get to it. Yeah. I just want to see if anybody else has any questions. We'll definitely cover that.
I want to talk about the reference to the tribulation.
Okay, tribulation. Okay.
He was with Jesus on earth, and then he knew who he was speaking to. He was in that vision, he did not. He knew him on earth.
So your question is, did he know it was Jesus, Okay? All right. Okay. Any other questions? Yes, sir? Angels? Okay. Okay. All right. Any other? Oh, yes, ma'am?
I would like to know what I was in the Spirit really means.
Okay.
We hear people talk about that now, and it can't possibly.
All right. Anybody have any other questions? Those are all good questions here. Okay. So let's look at verses 9 through 11 for a moment here. He says, I, John, your brother and fellow partaker in the tribulation, kingdom, and perseverance, which are in Jesus, was in an island called Patmos, because of the word of God and testimony of Jesus. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and heard behind me a loud voice like the sound of a trumpet, saying, Write in a book what you see, and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus and to Smyrna, to Pergamum, Thyatira, to Sardis, to Philadelphia, Laodicea. So, one question I have for you guys is, why does he say your brother? I, John, your brother, and fellow partaker in these things here. Why does he say that as opposed to apostle? You know, we read the letters of Paul, and most times he references the idea that he's an apostle. And given that John would have been the last living apostle, so the last of the 12, everybody else had been martyred by this time, why not reference the fact that, you know, I'm the last apostle? Why does he say your brother? I, John, your brother. Any thoughts? Did anybody see? Okay. Okay. Yes, ma'am?
I think it's because he uses being a fellow heir, like.
Okay. Yes, ma'am? Okay. All right. So, it is true he's writing to the churches, so he is a brother. What we want to get in the habit of doing is asking why he picked this language versus some other language. So, we have a tendency to refer to people by a first name, a last name, a title, a nickname, you know, and it really depends on the situation, and we have different connotations that come to our mind and their mind based on the title that we're using. So when John says, I, John, your brother, he really is trying to make a connection with them. It's not important for him to say, I'm an apostle, listen to what I'm saying. We, as we get older, we come to realize that authority isn't all that it's cracked up to be. You know, we think about, well, I have right on my side, you need to do the right thing. You know, we can look at the government and we can see one branch is saying no to another branch, or one branch is saying you got to do this, another branch is saying no, and so we have all these issues going on, and there really is no way to make one person do something else. Even in our society, we have laws, but there is no way to make somebody not do something wrong. Authority really isn't all that it's cracked up to be. And we come to understand that as our children get older, because when they're younger, we can actually physically corral them and limit them and do things to them. But as they get older, that goes away. So John, even though he is an apostle, he's not trying to say, I have the authority to tell you these things, do these things. He's just trying to say, I'm your brother. I'm just like the rest of you that get together on the first day of the week. I get together with everybody else. And so I'm your brother, you're my sister, we're in this together. And you notice that he says, I'm your brother and a fellow partaker, fellow participant. And what did your translation have, Leon? You had a different word. Your brother and companion and partner. Companion. So he really wants to make sure that people understand that even though he's an apostle, that doesn't make him different than anybody else. All it means is he had different responsibilities given to him, and he has different obligations. But in the church, in the kingdom, we're all equal because there's just one head, and we're all different parts of the body. And so, the thumb is not more important than the ear. They're all needed here. So John goes off saying, I'm your brother and fellow participant. And I want you to notice that he says, you're a participant in tribulation, in the kingdom, and then in perseverance. He's a co-participant in these three things here. So let me ask you, what does he mean by tribulation? Okay, and Leon's exactly right. I want you to see that as suffering. If we look back at John 16. In John 16, he says in verse 29, so the disciples say in verse 29 of John 16, his disciples said, now you are speaking plainly and are not using a figure of speech. Now we know that you know all things and have no need for anyone to question you. By this we believe that you have come from God. Jesus answered them, do you now believe? Behold, an hour is coming, and has already come, for you to be scattered, each to his own home, and to leave me alone. And yet I am not alone, because the Father is with me. These things I have spoken to you, so that in me you may have peace. In the world you have tribulation, but take courage, I have overcome the world. The New Testament uses the word tribulation through all the letters and in the Gospels here. And given the time of our society, tribulation is not a word we use. We don't really walk up to somebody and say, I hear you have a lot of tribulations going on. We just don't do that. Except in as much as you may be a dispensationalist and then you're looking for the great tribulation. All this massive suffering is going to come sometime in the future. Depending on your teacher, you may know the exact moment when that suffering is going to come on here. But tribulation, as it's used in the New Testament, is really just talking about suffering here. So then, why does he say kingdom next? He says, I'm your fellow participant in tribulation. I'm your fellow participant in kingdom. What does he mean there? Did anybody see it as strange?
Jesus created a new kingdom within the kingdom.
Say that again?
Jesus created a new kingdom within the kingdom, kingdom of the world.
Okay. Gotcha.
You're supposed to say it as church instead, it says kingdom and not church, which is what I would have to say.
Okay. So, let me make that note. Why not church? Because we don't use the word kingdom today, unless you're going to go over to Saudi Arabia, you're going to go to the kingdom. That's what it's called there. We think of terms of countries, and we don't use the word kingdom. But in the first century, there weren't countries like we think about it. There were kingdoms. This is why you had the Roman emperor He was a ruler over multiple kingdoms. That's what an emperor was. You had all these kings, authority over this geographical area, and then you had this guy who was lord over all these kings. And so John says, I'm your fellow participant in tribulation and the kingdom. We think about tribulation being suffering, but what does he mean by the kingdom? Why is he saying that? Why not say church? You know, I'm your brother and fellow participant in the church. That would make sense to us, but we don't talk about kingdom much. I mean, outside of church, I never use the word kingdom, unless I'm reading some fantasy story. You got a kingdom going on here, so it's not a word I ever use. So why is John saying kingdom? Okay, so the word was prevalent at the time, and so it was a common word here.
Would that again mean more towards the Old Testament? Because
No.
in the Old Testament, did they talk about the kingdom more than did they talk about the people in the church? I mean, I don't mean the same thing, but did they use that wording instead of saying church? I don't know.
Well, we do know that he just talks about churches, right, to the 7 churches. So he knows the word church. And so, yes, ma'am? Well, no, we equate the church and the kingdom to be equal, but that's not the case. Okay, say again? Yes, there is a kingdom in heaven here, and okay, what was the first part then? Yes, but we're not talking about what the Jews were expecting. We're talking about what the last living apostle, why did he use the word kingdom? So, I want you to get in the mindset of thinking that you're living in the 1st century and you're in the Roman Empire. You're in a kingdom. You could go next door to another kingdom here. And John is saying, well, I'm your brother in the kingdom. And this kingdom is the kingdom of God, so that you're not part of the kingdom of the Roman Empire. You're part of God's kingdom. And while today we would talk about the church, in the 1st century, he wants to talk about the kingdom. Because again, why is it that people are suffering? He's not talking about that you're suffering because you were an evildoer, like 1 Peter talks about. Why is it that people were suffering in the 1st century? They're being persecuted. And they're being persecuted because the kingdom of the world didn't like what they stood for, which is okay because they belong to a different kingdom, which is exactly what Jesus says at the very last moment. It's like, if my kingdom were of this world, even now my disciples would be out here freeing me. But it's not. So you don't need to worry about me. So John starts off his letter, I, John, your brother and fellow participant in the tribulation and kingdom. He does these in order because you have suffering solely because we belong to a different kingdom, which, of course, has an implication. And this is the one that we don't like and we have struggles with. If you don't have suffering, it's because you're not in the kingdom, or you have capitulated and just given up. At the end of the 2nd century, start of the 3rd century, we had Diocletian come to power. He was the last Roman emperor that really struggled and tried to destroy the church. Okay, so he eventually failed after 10 years of doing everything he could and whatnot here. But in the course of his 10 years of persecution, there were lots of Christians who capitulated, who got a piece of paper that said they were acceptable to the Roman Empire. Now, sometimes they got the piece of paper because they just said that the emperor is God, emperor is Lord. Other times they got the piece of paper because they just bought it on the black market. Other times they got the piece of paper because they just made up a piece of paper here. No matter how they got it, it looked like they were part of the Roman Empire here and not part of the Christian Empire. So once Diocletian was done away with and Constantine came to power, the church had a real struggle with what to do with Christians who had capitulated a few years earlier and did not suffer. They avoided any sort of suffering, whereas these guys had gone into hiding or had parents, had spouses, had children who were tortured, beaten, and killed. And they just didn't know what to do. Some of them said, you left the church, you're never part of the church, you cannot come back. Others like, well, we can forgive them, come back here. And there was a big struggle. We need to see this connection between suffering and being in the kingdom here. If you're not suffering, you're not part of the kingdom. Which, of course, begs the question, what do we mean by suffering? And this, again, where we go wrong. Because we see suffering in the first century as you stood up for God and you got thrown to the lions. You stood up for God, you were cast into prison. You stood up for God and you got executed. And that certainly was a prevalent form of suffering, but that wasn't the only form of suffering. And what we have come to realize and what we need to realize is that suffering is when the kingdom of the world does something to us. So, today, each of you has an opportunity to tell somebody who's not part of the kingdom the truth. Whatever truth they need to hear. And if you say the truth to them and they don't like it, okay. If you say the truth to them and they don't really want to be in your sphere of friends anymore, well, you are suffering because you told the truth. I don't know if you ever had family members who just don't want to hang around you as much unless they're forced to, because they know that you believe these things, and implicitly that means you're condemning these things, and so they just don't want that. Okay? I want you to come to understand that suffering really is more than I had a limb cut off, I was thrown into jail, and I'm going to be burned alive. Suffering really is when you stand up for the truth, either through your words or through your life or through your decisions, and the world does not like it. The world does not like it. Which is why he rolls from tribulation to kingdom. Because when you're suffering, it's because you're part of God's kingdom. And the world does not like God. But take hope, because Jesus overcome the world. Which, of course, leads us to the very next thing, perseverance. He goes from you're suffering because you're part of the kingdom, and I need you to persevere. Just a second, Joseph. I need you to persevere. Because it's so easy for us to give up. It's so easy for us to say, I'm tired of watching my language at work. I'm tired of people avoiding me because they think I'm a goody two-shoes. I'm tired of having to explain, no, I don't want to go to this party because you guys are just going to get drunk. You guys are just going to do these things that I don't think is even remotely acceptable. I'm tired of people hitting on me and me saying, no, I'm happily married. Yes, I have problems. Yes, I have struggles, but it's one wife. That's all I need. I'm tired of having to explain these things here. And so this is why John says, I need you to persevere. Because that is what it comes down to. We're going to suffer at various levels because we're part of the kingdom, but we have got to persevere. And that is what the Revelation is all about. You know bad things are going to happen. I need you to persevere. I don't need you to give up the day before God comes. It would be nice, honestly, if we knew when God was going to come back. We could plan our lives and say, okay, I've just got to hang in another 3 weeks. I can do it for 3 weeks. But we don't know that, which is why God just says, I need you to persevere. I need you to persevere. I need you to persevere. When we read the 7 letters to the churches, we'll see perseverance is a big theme, because I need you to persevere, because you just don't know what's going on. So I, John, your brother, fellow participant, tribulation, kingdom, perseverance, well, this is who John is. He isn't somebody who is way up here and who has no idea of what you're going through. As a matter of fact, he knows exactly what you're going through. He's suffered. He's been persecuted. You know, church history says that near the end of John's life, he just wasn't able to walk. And young men carried him around on a palisade. You know, this like a big pallet sort of thing here, but, you know, they'd carry him along here. And he would make them take him out of certain bathhouses because false teachers would come in that were teaching radical things. And he would make them take them out because he would say God could certainly do something, and he didn't want to be part of this destruction going on here because these things were going on. And his influence was greatly diminished over time because, as we understand, when you have a certain look in life and you have certain accoutrements, you have certain address, certain resources, it looks like you're successful and God's taking care of you. It looks like you're all blessed, and this poor old guy over here doesn't look like he's blessed, therefore he's against God. And so more people gravitate towards this person over here. And so John certainly had seen those things, and I'm sure it really broke his heart because he had talked with Jesus. He's now seeing Jesus. He knows the truth. And these people are believing a lie, and he can't persuade them out of that lie. It's just heartbreaking. So he understands about tribulation, about kingdom, and he understands most importantly about perseverance. And it's these things that John wants to open up his letter saying, this is who I am. I'm your brother, and I'm your brother in tribulation, kingdom, and perseverance. Joseph, you had a question?
No, I had a comment.
Oh, okay.
If we go to the dictionary, we'll see that kingdom means you have to have a king, a territory, and subjects. And then with the church, it's an assembly. So that's probably why he used kingdom, because we're his God's subjects. So he also says at the end of the sentence, in Jesus.
We'll talk about that in Jesus just a second here. He uses the word kingdom because he just reminded us that Jesus is King of Kings. He just reminded us that we are a kingdom of priests. In previous verse, he reminds us that we're part of this kingdom. And so again, that means we have certain expectations. If we're part of this kingdom, well, that means we have certain rights, but certain obligations. We need to behave a certain way because this is how people in this kingdom behave here. One of the things I want you to see is that John says, let's see here. Okay. John says, I was in the Spirit in the Lord's day, and I was in Patmos. So we got a physical, we have a spiritual, and we have a temporal. And these are our locations. John chooses to describe, when he starts off this letter, saying, this is where I am. I'm physically in this island, but spiritually, I'm with God. And at this moment in time, it's the Lord's day. Now, if you have questions, we'll talk about this. The Lord's day is just the first day of the week. And that should also mean to us that the people who are receiving this letter are reading this letter. which is what he said back in verse 3, that you are going to have this blessing for those who read this letter. So they're reading this letter on the same day, maybe weeks apart here, when John receives the vision here. So there's this connection that people now have with John because he is receiving this vision on the Lord's day. And while he physically is in Patmos, spiritually, he's with Jesus, which is an important distinction that we have got to come to accept and use to empower us. We are physically in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Okay, nothing wrong with that. No problem with that. But spiritually, we need to be with God. Because it doesn't matter about Tulsa. If Tulsa becomes the greatest city in the world, okay. If it becomes the worst city in the world, okay. It isn't of great importance to us because what's important to us is we're in God's kingdom and we're with Jesus. And we're where Jesus wants us to be. And so our physical location isn't nearly as important as our spiritual location. And that's why John says that, I'm on the island of Patmos. So you know where I am, and I'm separate and apart from you, but that's really of low importance. Because on the first day of the week, when you worship, I was worshiping, and when you were singing songs to God, well, I saw God. And he wanted me to write down this vision and convey it to the churches. And so he lists off the churches he's going to convey it to. And then more than that, it's all the churches here. So even though he says these 7 churches, it's not all the churches that existed. This letter is given to all the churches, which means it's given to us. Which again means that on this day, when we are thinking about John, when we're going to worship God, it was this day, how many weeks ago, how many thousands of years ago, when John received a vision that we're reading about. So again, we have this connection with John because we're part of the same kingdom. And of course, he's our brother. And so John is trying to do all he can to help us understand that this isn't just some weird person off in some strange place that took some strange mushrooms and saw some strange things. No, this is a man who walked with Jesus, taught with Jesus, and is now in exile because he walked with Jesus and talked with Jesus. He's on this island that's really unimportant, and he's worshiping God like you are worshiping God. And he is doing it on the first day of the week like you were doing it on the first day of the week. And he received a vision, and he obeyed God, and he wrote it down, and we are reading it. And John says that when we hear it or we read it, we receive a blessing, just like he received a blessing, because in the final analysis, we are all brothers and sisters. We are all fellow participants in suffering in the kingdom and in perseverance. So we're not so different from John. John saw Jesus, but when we read, we see Jesus. John didn't understand certain things about Jesus. We don't understand certain things about Jesus here. And so John is trying to make that connection right from the get-go so we understand what it is we're about to engage in. He says, I, John, your brother and fellow partaker in the tribulation, kingdom, and perseverance, which are in Jesus. Joseph mentioned that's in Jesus here. Being a part of the kingdom is because we're in Jesus. Being somebody who perseveres is because we're in Jesus. Being somebody who experiences tribulation is because we're in Jesus. It's our relationship to Jesus that determines what's going to happen to us. And since Jesus is the King of kings, the Lord of lords, since he's the King of the ruler of all nations, he has a kingdom, and we are members of that kingdom. And because he suffered, well, it shouldn't surprise us that we suffer. When he has these things happen to him, shouldn't surprise us that we have these things happen to them. Because if it happens to the greatest of them, then it'll happen to the least of them. And that is why John talks about being in Jesus. So that we understand all these things are because we have a relationship with Jesus, which we need to remind ourselves of, because Satan wants to say something other than that to us. He wants to say, sure, you got baptized. Sure, you said some prayers. Sure, you've done a few good deeds. But really, are you still that faithful? Really, haven't you already capitulated? Really, haven't you already basically given up? Why don't you just finalize it, give up completely, and fall away? Satan is always whispering lies in our ear, mixed with a certain level of truth. Which is why John says, I'm your fellow brother. I'm your brother. I'm your fellow participant. Tribulation, kingdom, perseverance, and all that is in Jesus. Which is why he ends with perseverance. Because this is the most important thing. I have 4 children. One's in a foreign country. She might be watching this. She might be worshiping God. Might not. I got one older son. He's being a bum today. When he watched this, you'll hear me call him out being a bum. He didn't come to worship here. I got 2 younger sons. They're sick. They didn't have a whole lot of choice here. But those of us who have a choice, the difference between being here and not being here solely comes down to just persevering. And that is what life is all about. That is one of the lessons fathers always teach their children. You've just got to persevere. You don't want to go to work. Duh. Who wants to go to work? Okay, you don't feel well. Duh. Okay, you still got to go to work. You still have bills. You still have responsibilities. You've just got to persevere. And in some sense, it does get easier the older you get. But in another sense, it gets even harder because you're just tired. You see Norman. He came in late. He's tired. You know, it just takes him longer to move. He doesn't go as fast as possible. What?
He was here.
I watched him walk in with everybody after everybody else.
He was sitting back there.
Where are you, Norman?
He was here before we walked in.
You're ruining my illustration. Come on. Yeah. I'll wait till another Sunday when he's actually late. You were late. All right. Worley was late. Yes, sir. Okay.
What's the difference between perseverance and endurance?
Well, we might have a distinction in English, and sometimes we differently translate those differences here. So, endure usually has the idea of never giving up. Perseverance, sometimes you can give up, and then you come back, and you can give up, and you come back here. You know, so perseverance, you can recover that. So, while my son's not here this Sunday, next Sunday he'll come around and say, okay, I need to go ahead and do that here. And that's the great thing about God, honestly, is that every day is just a brand new day. You know, and God is not having this big long list saying, okay, Charles, you have now committed your 1 millionth sin. Over here, you have 100 good deeds. Okay, they're out of balance and you're getting more and more in debt. He doesn't do that. He just says, all right, it's a new day. I believe in you. I've empowered you. You can do better. You can say kinder words. You can do kinder things. You can avoid sin. You can do these good things. And when the day's over, it might have been a better day, might have been a worse day. It doesn't matter because God will give me a new day. And the awesome thing about God is that if we live long enough, over time, we really are changed. Over time, we really can find our words being better. Over time, we can really find spontaneously wanting to do nice things to other people. Whereas before, we might have been like, well, should I, shouldn't I? Are they going to burn me, take advantage of me, this, that? We just get older and we're like, okay, I can do this. And then if we could just see our younger self, we could see we really are a different person. But I know for me, I see myself the same way I saw myself however long ago. It's just me. And I might be different, and I can see some ways in which I am different, but overall, I don't see that change. Which is a great thing about seeing other people's children. It's like, whoa, you're really big now. You just hit your growth spurt. You look a lot different. You're acting different. You're asking different questions, because we can see in the course of a few years that dramatic change. But somehow we think once we hit 25, we don't really change that much, but we really do. And so John is trying to remind us of all these things here at the very start. Okay. Lord's Day. Let me just make one comment, possibly, about that here. In the first century, this unusual word for Lord, in the first century, there was a word used for the emperor's day. And the emperor had a day once a month, the first day of the month, when everybody did things towards the emperor. You know, it was semi-holiday, taking care of debts, things like that here. And John uses similar wordage to say the Lord's Day. He's the first one to say this, and in later centuries, this terminology was used to talk about the first day of the week, where it became common, saying that you belong to the emperor, but we belong to the Lord. This is your day that you take care of whatever you know to Domitian or Nero or whatnot, but this is the day, every first day of the week, when we devote ourselves to Jesus Christ. We devote ourselves to the Father and the Spirit. This is His day. And that's what he means by in the Lord's Day. I want you to realize that this does not, so I'll write this down here, Lord's Day does not equal Day of the Lord. That's an Old Testament concept used in the prophets, talking about a day of judgment. And so that is the day of the Lord, and we see it a number of times in the New Testament, but that's completely different phraseology than the Lord's Day here. So I just want you to see it really is the first day of the week, Sunday. That's when John was experiencing these visions on the Lord's Day. Any particular questions? Oh, yes. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. Let's talk about that here. What are people's thoughts about in the Spirit? Just throw out an answer while I'm erasing. Don't be bashful. In the Spirit. What does it mean in the Spirit? What does he mean by saying, I was in the Spirit? Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Okay. So we do recognize that we just read in previous verses about the seven spirits before God's throne, about the Holy Spirit here. So in the Spirit is talking about something in relationship to God, the Holy Spirit here. We do see he used this 4 times in the Revelation, and each time in a different location. It describes the location. So here, he was in the Spirit on the island of Patmos. If we look at our Old Testament references, we'll see a number of references to the book of Ezekiel. And Ezekiel was in the Spirit, a similar phrase, when he received God's visions here. So when John says, I was in the Spirit, he means he was receiving this vision from God. So it's a vision. It wasn't something he was physically experiencing at the moment here, where we could see it. We do read earlier on in 2 Corinthians that Paul uses same phraseology about I was caught up into the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know. So he didn't know at that time if he was just seeing a vision and everybody else just looked at him sitting there, or if he really was transported to the third heaven. He doesn't know. And so we don't know if something particular happened to the Apostle John in the Spirit. What we do know is this is his way of saying that I was with Jesus, I was the Holy Spirit, I was doing something in the spiritual realm, I was doing something spiritually as opposed to physically, which is important for us because as we see these visions, we're going to see that when people try to draw these visions, well, you get a crazy picture because they're not meant to be observed literally. You know, I like to say that I picked out my blue shirt and my blue undershirt for whatever reason. In actuality, it's just next in the line of shirts here. You know, that's the way it goes. But John describes Jesus the way he does because he wants us to see certain background imagery. He wants us to see certain expectations. He wants us to make certain connections with the Old Testament and understanding about Jesus and it growing. So he's not meant for you to see that our Lord and Savior has this sword that's two-edged coming out of his mouth. That's not the goal. The goal is to say, well, what does the sword represent? And why is he using that sort of imagery? What kind of picture should it conjure up in our mind? So when he says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like the sound of a trumpet. You should pay attention to the word like. So it wasn't a trumpet. It was just like a trumpet. This is one of John's favorite words that describes something as a simile. You know, he's going to use metaphorical language all the time, like or as. And when he uses the word trumpet, again, you know, we're picturing some instrument that we know from band, but that's not what John meant at all. The trumpet was something that was involved in worship of God. The trumpet was something that was used to describe God's voice. The trumpet was used in this relationship to God. So when he says, I heard behind me a loud voice like the sound of a trumpet, you should understand something more than just a voice, but a divine voice. Yes, sir.
In history, they say that when kings came into the town, sorry, that the trumpet would sound before they were entered into the congregation.
Yes, and they do that because of the Bible. It's like, well, if God announced his presence with the trumpet, I'm like God, so I'll announce it. He just had one trumpet, I'm going to have 12 trumpeters. The ego of people is just unbelievable here. But that's why kings do a lot of things, because God did it, so they think they should do it because they're like God. Which is sarcastic, they're not really like God here. Okay, so we did tribulation, and we did in the Spirit here. And, okay.
So people say, I was in the Spirit, and I'm dancing around and speaking in tongues. That's not the same thing. In the Spirit, biblically, in the Revelation means receiving things from God, right?
Yes, but, so, let's just digress, because I digress a lot here. I don't believe that we have the miraculous today. But I certainly could be wrong. So the evidence for no miraculous versus miraculous is very tenuous in the best of times here. And if the miraculous still existed, then they would be in the spiritual realm when they're receiving those sort of things here. So when a person received a prophecy from God, they were in the Spirit when they received that prophecy. You know, so in that sense, it would be the same. You know, if somebody wants to say, I was in the Spirit doing these things, okay. You know, what I know is that John records him being in the Spirit just these 4 times, and that's it. We don't have him writing the gospel saying anything about Jesus being in the Spirit. We don't have him writing his letters saying he was in the Spirit and like that. It's just here, and it's just so he can receive a vision from God to convey to his people that they have got to persevere in their kingdom and not be overwhelmed by the kingdom of the dragon. Because if we jump ahead to chapter 12, what we see is the dragon has already lost. He already made his play for dominion, and God kicked him out, so he already lost. And now it's just a mop-up operation. And he's going to be cast in the lake of fire, and then that's that. So we just need to realize that we have got to persevere. That's why it's always sad when you read stories about World War I or World War II, and you read somebody sent home a letter saying, I hope to see you soon, but after the ceasefire was called, they died. Because it seems so unfair. It's not surprising if they died before the ceasefire was called, but after the ceasefire, they shouldn't have died. And it'd be a sad thing for us if we give up when God is this close to coming. He's on his way, as we talked about earlier. He's on his way. We just need to persevere. More clarification? Okay, good. Okay. He says, write in me a book, what you see, and send it to the 7 churches that are in Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Laodicea, and Philadelphia. Those are all in like a horseshoe shape. They're about 40 miles apart. We don't know exactly why John picked these 7 churches. It could be he picked these 7 churches because he had a connection with each of those churches. We don't know that. It could be he picked those 7 churches because they were just on this postal route. That's a possibility. It could be he picked these 7 churches because each of them had a slightly different problem, and he wanted to illustrate everything that in totality describes all the churches. We don't know. What we do know is that these were 7 literal churches that actually existed, but they're more than that. That's why each of the letters ends by, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So this is why we're reading it today, because even though we're not the church at Ephesus, we can still lose our first love, and we can still have these struggles, we can still have these problems. So we need to read about these things, because God is trying to teach us. Because the older you get, the more you realize there really aren't any unique problems. It really just comes down to power, money, sex, those sort of things here. And that's really what it all comes down to. And everybody has the same struggles. And while it might be tweaked slightly different, you can boil it down to, here's your struggle about whether you want to be selfish or not selfish here. So Jesus commands him to write to these 7 churches. And this is very much in the likeness of how the prophets in the Old Testament received a vision and were commanded to convey it to the nation of Israel or to the nation of Judah here. So John is being commissioned by God, and he's writing these things here. In verse 12, so 12 through 16, we have these descriptions of Jesus, and we're expected to use our Old Testament. We're expected to see some imagery that's associated with God, some imagery that's associated with the priesthood, with power, things like that, because this is what John is seeing. In verse 12 it says, then I turned to see the voice. Okay, so I really want you to notice a connection and a contrast between seeing and hearing in the Revelation. John hears tons of things, but when he turns around to see it, it doesn't match up the way we think. And one informs the other. So I turned to see the voice that was speaking with me, and having turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. Now we know the 7 golden lampstands are the churches, And so he's hearing the churches, but more than that, he's hearing Jesus in the midst of the church. And in the midst of the lampstands, I saw one like a son of man. So let's stop there. So what does he mean? I saw one like a son of man. Thoughts? Okay.
Like, why would you use the word like? It's trying to compare it with the Son of Man and Jesus.
You know, so those are both good questions. I know when I was a first Christian, this verse confused me to no end. I'd read enough of the Gospels to see Jesus refer to himself as the Son of Man. So why say like the Son of Man?
Well, he doesn't, what confuses me is he doesn't say like the Son of Man, which I would think would be Jesus. He says like a
Okay.
Son of Man.
Okay. So let me ask you a related question. Why does Jesus call himself Son of Man? Okay, so humanity, that's one reason. So in the prophet, that's correct, in the prophet Ezekiel, Ezekiel is referred to as a son of man dozens of times. And in that context, God is trying to say, you're a human being. So in that sense, when Jesus talks about himself being the Son of Man, he is emphasizing his humanity. But there also is another reason. He refers to himself as the Son of Man. And, go ahead. His mission. Okay. What'd you say? I'm so disappointed. I've only talked about these things for months and months and months. Let's all go back to Daniel, our good friend Daniel. Chapter 7. We've read this verse, I dare say, at least a half dozen times, maybe even more. Oh, man. My wife is on it. So, we're going to start in verse 9. So, Daniel's receiving a vision, chapter 7. And he says, I kept looking until, in verse 9, until thrones were set up and the Ancient of Days took his seat. Ancient of Days is God here. His vesture was like white snow, which we are going to see in the next few verses of Revelation. And the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was ablaze with flames, and his wheels were a burning fire. A river of fire was flowing, and coming out from before him, thousands upon thousands were attending him, and myriads upon myriads were standing before him. The court sat, and the books were opened. Again, we see a lot of this same imagery used at the end of the Revelation and throughout the Revelation. Verse 11, then I kept looking because of the sound of the boastful words which the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body was destroyed and given to the burning fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but an extension of life was granted to them for an appointed period of time. Verse 13, I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom. And all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. The dominion is an everlasting dominion, which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. So in Daniel chapter 7, we see one like a son of man approaching God to receive his kingdom, receive his power. So one like a son of man is Jesus, and at his ascension, he received this power. That's why he says at the end of Matthew, all authority has been given to me, because he had received everything. And while Satan in the temptations wanted to give him all the kingdoms of the world, it was a cheap buy-off because he was going to get all the kingdoms of the world in a short time. So we get to the Revelation, and it says that Jesus is the ruler of all the kings of the earth. So he has this kingdom. So when the Apostle John in Revelation chapter 1 says, there was one like a son of man, he expects you to think back to Daniel chapter 7 and verse 13. He expects you to make that connection that in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 13, one like a son of man approached the Ancient of Days, God, and received all this. And so when John hears a voice and turns around, and sees the 7 gold lampstands and one like the Son of Man in the midst, he's making a connection with Daniel chapter 7 and saying that this voice I'm hearing is divine, is Jesus. When Jesus in the Gospels talks about the Son of Man, he's mostly talking about his humanity, but he also is talking about Daniel 7:13 and his deity being divine. So,
In Daniel, is that the first time Son of Man is used?
no, it says like a Son of Man there. So Daniel would have written his book after Ezekiel. And you read Ezekiel, you see Son of Man all the time. And some translations just talk about a human being there, because that is what they meant. And so here in Daniel, he's drawn from the prophet Ezekiel, is saying there's like this person who's like a human being, but he's not. And so Jesus is a human being, but he's more than that. He is also divine, which is why you have Son of Man being used and then Son of God. And Jesus almost always uses the Son of Man to refer to himself, because he is saying, I have this connection with both Ezekiel and Daniel. And more than that, I have a connection with all of you. I was born of Mary, born of Joseph. I can trace my lineage back, all these things. Oh, I guess I'm way out of time. Okay, sorry. We'll end class and we'll pick up later there.